Bakari K. Lumumba, the progenitor of LumumbaSpeaks.com, a Black empowerment initiative where we believe we could gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black. Back once again in conjunction with Bequaline Network, the Pan-African social media extraordinaire and the home of African-centered news and information. And we are here for part 13 of our groundbreaking, revolutionary Pan-African Leadership Series, Past, Present, and Future, where we chronicle great Pan-Africanists of the past in order to learn how to create a better world for African people in the future. If you have not already, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button, hit the notification bell as well. Make sure that you're a blessing to the show via Cash App, Venmo, and of course, Super Chat. So once again, family, make sure that you hit the like, subscribe button, share as well, hit that notification bell. You're watching, of course, LumumbaSpeaks.com in conjunction with, of course, the Bequaline Network. The link is in the description, family, and we will be putting the link in the chat momentarily. Want to touch base with you all on one, you can put a 1 in the chat, 2 in the chat if you are unaware. But if you are familiar with Maurice Bishop, of course, the former Prime Minister of Grenada, right? Of course, and the leader of the New Jewel movement. So put a 1 in the chat if you're familiar with Maurice Bishop. Put a 2 in the chat if you are unfamiliar with Maurice Bishop. But we want to make sure that we are, of course, referencing and honoring the great line of divine that is, of course, Pan-African leadership. If you are unaware of who Maurice Bishop was, he, of course, was the Prime Minister of course, Grenada, and the leader of the New Jewel movement. We'll get a little bit into the New Jewel movement and what it was, and what it encompassed, what it encompassed. But also, he was a Marxist-Leninist revolutionary, Pan-African revolutionary. He sought to prioritize social economic development, education, and of course, Black power and Black liberation. Of course, many of you may be aware of the fact that, of course, Grenada was invaded in October of 1983 by the United States under the gauze of seeking to protect American medical students. Black Canadian says, I'm ashamed to say I've never heard of him when I come from a Caribbean background, but that's quite all right. That's quite all right, brother. That's one of the reasons why, of course, we are doing the Pan-African Leadership Series. One is to make brothers and sisters aware, of course, of the great leaders in Pan-Africanism. As I'm quite sure you are aware, we've just touched base on this a couple of times on my platform. And of course, you are aware of this concept of the FBA ADOS. And so there tends to be this belief that Pan-Africanism is African-American centered. One of the benefits of course, this Pan-African Leadership Series, where we're going to be chronicling the life, legacy, and of course, of almost 200 great Pan-Africanists, is we're going to be able to see that Pan-Africanism has not been centered on the African-American experience and African-American leadership. And so this is an example of that today. Of course, this is part 13 of our groundbreaking Pan-African Leadership Series, Past, Present, and Future, where, of course, we are chronicling the life and legacy, and most importantly, the work of great Pan-Africanists of yesteryear in order to make a better world for African people in the future. And so, of course, today we're discussing Maurice Bishop and, of course, the new Jewel movement. If many of you are unaware, the New Jewel movement, also known as the New Joint Endeavor for Welfare, Education, and Liberation, of course, was established in 1973. And of course, this was due to the fact that it was a Marxist-Leninist government. Of course, the United States government took umbrage, and of course, they soured relations with the United States. Of course, they sought to of course, seek government aid from Cuba, align themselves with the Eastern Bloc, and they even sought to closely work with Cuba to provide assistance to left-wing revolutionary movements around the world, such as the Southwest African People's Organization in Namibia, known as SWAPO. So, unfortunately, of course, Bishop was assassinated by someone who he considered to be, of course, a contemporary and a friend. And then a couple of days later, the U.S. and government invaded, of course, and that was the end of the movement. But one of the things that we tend to look over is, of course, the struggle for, of course, not only Black progress, but also Black self-determination, right? We know oftentimes what we like to call many African nations, even Caribbean nations, they receive symbolic independence, right? What some people call flag independence, right? But it's an independence on paper, but not independence socially, economically, in terms of being able to be independent of course, not the global north, right? And so I think this is an example, of course, of Maurice Bishop, the New Jewel movement, seeking to do that and being unable to do so for a variety of reasons. Unfortunately, as we know, he is now a martyr when it comes to, of course, the concept and idea and the Pan-Africanist movement. But I think he is someone that needs to be honored, particularly when we talk about, many people talk about this concept of strongman leadership. They really speak ill in terms of Black men, irrespective of what they're on the continent, the Caribbean, or the United States, in terms of their leadership tactics. But he was someone who did advocate for the working poor. He advocated for women's rights, of course, suffrage, promoting literacy, so on and so forth. So we can even argue that, I mean, he was actually a contemporary of Thomas Sankara. Of course, this took place in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, and Thomas Sankara became head of state, I believe, in 84 and became apostle. So really trying to push back against a lot of the misinformation about Pan-African leadership, not only on the continent, but in the Caribbean and even in the United States as well, in North America, because Canada as well. So these are some of the issues that, of course, we want to address. So tap in, family. I want to put the link in the chat if you want to tap in, be part of the conversation regarding Maurice Bishop. If you want to share, of course, information about Maurice Bishop, or really what can we learn, of course, from Maurice Bishop, of course, his leadership. Of course, he was head of state for a short period of time, but what can we learn from his work, his legacy, that we can continue to make the world better for African people? So once again, family, the link is in the description. The link is in the chat. You're watching LaMovementSpeaks.com, a Black empowerment initiative where we believe we can gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black in conjunction with Bequaline Network, the Pan-African social media extraordinaire, and the home of African-centered news and information. So tap in, family, and be part of the conversation. So I'd love to hear from you all, and let's get this conversation started, right? So once again, family, the link is in the description. The link is in the chat. This is part 13, keyword family, part 13 of our groundbreaking Pan-African Leadership Series, Past, Present, and Future, where we're discussing the former Prime Minister of Grenada, Maurice Bishop, and, of course, the New Jewel movement. Black Canadian, what's the word?
How's it going, man? I'm doing pretty good. How about you?
I'm doing quite all right. Thanks for asking.
So what's your opinion on like Marxism? Are you a fan?
I'm not a Marxist, but I understand why many African, Caribbean, and of course African American, Afro-Canadian brothers and sisters have turned to Marxism, right? When you do your research on the oppression that African people have faced, irrespective if it's on the continent or here in the New World, we find that part of that oppression was economic exploitation. Right, and that economic exploitation came under a capitalist system. So I could understand why someone would turn to a economic frame of reference that seeks to counter, of course, the type of the system of economic exploitation that we were suffering under.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, but I'm not a Marxist. But so yeah, I don't. I've read some Marxist literature, of course, when I was an undergraduate, but that was a long time ago. So
do you believe?
I can't give an in-depth, of course, description of what Marxism is.
Gotcha. And was Maurice Bishop aligned with the Soviet Union?
Well, yes, he of course he did align with the Soviet Union as well as Cuba. Absolutely.
Okay, so that's I'm guessing that's why America invaded.
Well, yeah, so America invaded after he was assassinated, but of course, once he came to power, relations with the United States soured because, of course, of his Marxist-Leninist background, and of course, his willingness to side with the Eastern Bloc. Because during that time, we were dealing with the Cold War, right? And so it was either, oftentimes you found yourself in a position where either you were with NATO or the Warsaw Pact. But
and like, sorry, go ahead.
Was one of the things that he did that that really speaks to his Pan-Africanist, of course, ethos was advocating and supporting, of course, liberation movements on the continent, particularly in Namibia. So that is something to, of course, shout out and, of course, honor in terms of the work that he did.
Like, do you think it? Because I'm not that familiar with Maurice Bishop, but like, do you think Grenada benefited from being aligned with the Soviet Union?
Well, I mean, I do know that one of the benefits, of course, with aligning with the Eastern Bloc at that time was that, excuse me, nations would be able to receive resources. Oftentimes, if you see nations fighting against, of course, the remnants of colonial rule, oftentimes the West, particularly the United States, would provide support in merely rhetoric. But if one did align themselves with the Eastern Bloc, of course, they received financial advisors, military assistance, of course, actual resources to help them try to develop the nation.
Oh, yeah, that's very true.
So, yeah. So I think that is something to consider. Yeah. DOD, I'm gonna let DOD tap in. DOD, what's the word? Appreciate you tapping back in, brother.
Hey man, how's it going?
We're having some issues. So I muted your mic, brother. It seems like you're having some technical difficulties, but you can unmute and join the conversation once you get things squared away. But I'm surprised, but Black Canadian. You stated that you're from the Caribbean, or West Indies, but you were unfamiliar with Brother Bishop, great ancestor.
Oh no. Well, background. Like my parents are from Jamaica, but like I was born in Canada.
Got you.
Yeah.
Okay. Understandable. Understandable. Absolutely. Brother DOD, are you good to go now?
Nope. Interesting.
Okay, yeah. So when you can get that squared away, we can let you tap back in, be part of the conversation. So part of the goal, like I said, of the series is to just make people aware, right, of the great line of divine, of the great Pan-Africanists who, of course, oftentimes, unfortunately, gave their lives, right, to work and fight for the liberation, and I will always argue to help restore our people to their traditional greatness. As we know, he was only 39 years old when he was assassinated. 39, right? So this was a relatively young man, right? And so I think it's important that we understand. And of course, we even know that his, a spouse or domestic partner, she was even assassinated along with him during that military coup. So, oftentimes these are individuals who are giving their all. They're making the ultimate sacrifice in order to try to make the world better for African people.
Yeah, it just seems like, man, it seems like all of our Pan-African leaders get assassinated.
Yeah. Brother DOD, are we good to go now?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm clueless about this guy, man.
Wow.
Yeah, this is the first time I've ever heard about this guy.
Wow.
So I would need like a brief, because Wikipedia has him listed as a Marxist,
right?
Which is what I find. They always tend to do that with like any type of Pan-African revolutionary leader. They seem to just somehow by default, if you're Pan-Africanism and you're fighting for Africa and you're fighting for the control of resources on the behalf of your people, they instantly put that communist or Marxist label on you. So
absolutely,
when I saw that, I was like, oh, here we go again.
Yeah.
But I'm clueless. So I've heard of his name just passingly, but I never like sat down to figure out who he was or what role he played in the overall Pan-African ideology. So it's going to be more of a listening session for me than anything. Just trying to learn a little bit.
Absolutely. So let me see if I can pull some information up on him. Because what I don't want to do is play something that's going to get us, taken off the air, right? Flagged. Let me see here if I can find something here, and then I think we'll be good to go. Yeah. So I think what I ought to do here, there's an interview by Gerald Ball, but he's interviewing someone who actually was a contemporary of Maurice Bishop, and then I could play that, and I think that will suffice. So give me 1 second, family. Just put that out here. Fair use, because I know what happens when we.
Where does he fall in like the timeline of Pan-Africanism? Like,
yeah, so 1980s, the early 80s. Yeah, so he, if I remember correctly, he was assassinated. Unfortunately, he was deleted. Yeah, probably about 3 weeks after I was born.
Oh wow.
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, I think it was the 19th of October, if I remember correctly, and I was born on, of course, the 26th of September. So yeah, absolutely.
Like, were other contemporary Caribbean leaders against him?
Well, we know he had support in Cuba, right? He had support in Cuba, so that is something that we do know. But oftentimes it's fragmented, right? You know, oftentimes what we will find is you may have a situation where there may be another nation that supports this leader, but they are in a position financially or politically to actually provide substantial support or means, right? So, for example, if we talk about the situation in Burkina Faso, right? Brother Ibrahim Touré, we used to, I would argue most of us, are in support of his administration, but many of us are in a position to actually tangibly assist his administration.
Correct.
You right? So, right, and so that becomes an issue because now it's an issue of power and resources.
Yep.
Right, and so do we have to, for example, but a DOD? If you don't mind me asking, what general vicinity are you located? You don't have to give me the city, but maybe state or country.
Somewhere in the Americas.
Okay, somewhere in the Americas. Very good. So you're in the Western world, right? And we're in support of something that you're doing. Let's say you were the head of state of, let's say, Belize, for example. Belize has a large Afro Black population, but we may not have the capacity to provide the resources to help you.
Correct.
Right, and so that oftentimes becomes the problem, where the support is ideological, it's social, right? But we don't have the capacity to provide the resources needed and necessary. Now, when we talk about the Boule, they do have the resources.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Oftentimes they don't support. Now there are times in which they do. For example, when of course Malcolm X was taken from us, his of course the Black Boule in New York City came together and bought her home, right, in Mount Vernon, and which is in north of New York City. And then of course they paid the tuition for her daughters, all of her daughters, to go to private school. So there are times where that takes place, but it tends to not be consistent.
And I think that's the ultimate. I just want to be frank here. I think that's the ultimate weakness in terms of the ideology of Pan-Africanism.
Okay, please, brother, go right ahead.
It lacks the proper infrastructure to actually come in and implement change and maintain the momentum of that. Because at the end of the day, countries have to function.
Yes, sir.
And speeches and support, while they may be inspirational, they are necessary. Let me be clear on that. Speaking and communicating and inspiring people, those are necessary mechanisms to inspire confidence in the population of the people. But eventually that wears off.
I agree. I understand where you're coming from, brother.
And real life conditions are going to be the ultimate measure of progress. And like I pointed out in our previous conversations about Kwame Nkrumah, he comes into power, and the individuals, the European banking and finance conglomerates know this, so they drain the treasury. They sabotage projects that are currently in development. They do everything in their power to destabilize the economic conditions that he is about to step into. And now Kwame Nkrumah
manipulating the price of cocoa globally would be an example.
Yep. And so now he's in a position to where, okay, what do I do? And then he realizes, okay, Africa must unite. But once he comes to the realization that Africa must unite, you have so many differing ideologies and worldviews that it becomes impossible for them to unite. And that's why I feel at that moment, had the diaspora been in a financial, economic advantage or position, they could have come in and helped Kwame and Nkrumah fill that void that was missing because of the way in which the Western interest destabilized the economy before Kwame Nkrumah comes into power. So,
yes, and let me speak to that very quickly, and I'm glad you brought that up. So one, when you talked about Pan-Africanism lacking infrastructure, I would agree with that, right? My master's thesis is titled, "Is Pan-Africanism Dead?" And I mentioned that we have to go far beyond simple cultural programming, but actually address the material conditions of the people, right? A good example of that, of course, from a contemporary frame of reference here in the United States is the work that's taking place with the Malcolm X Grassroots Association with the election of Chokwe Lumumba Sr. and now Jr. as, of course, mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. Right. So that would be one example.
Situation there.
I'm sorry?
I heard about that situation in Jackson, Mississippi. Where's go ahead.
Right. So that's one issue. Second issue, when we talk about the lacking infrastructure, is historically if we go back to the 19th century, Pan-Africanists were the Black elite. We talk about the Martin Delaney's, the Anna Julia Coopers, right? The Bishop Henry McNeil Turners of the world, right? The Mary Church Terrells, right? Back in the day, the elite, those with the resources, were the Pan-Africanists. And they were using those resources to help our people, irrespective of where we were in the world, right? That is, we talk about Bishop James T. Holly, for example, right? That is not the case now. Now, of course, we all love Marcus Garvey, but Marcus Garvey was, of course, he provided a cultural shift or sociological shift in Pan-Africanism, where he's the link between classical Pan-Africanism and modern Black nationalism. But the shift that took place with Garvey, even though he was a great organizer, was that when he became the preeminent figurehead of Pan-Africanism here in the West, was that he began to bringing in people who are more working class rather than, of course, white collar. And so what happens as a result is these individuals, even though we love them, they are brothers and, there's dignity in our work, lack the financial resources that individuals who, of course, were in the Black elite had. And so yes, go right ahead.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it appears that through the publications that Garvey was distributing, he was able to raise capital from that, and he was also able to issue stock.
Well, yes, he was able to raise
for people
capital.
for people within the movement to help finance the movement per se. So to a degree, in terms of raising money, I think he did that well. And I think Garvey did that extremely well in terms of raising capital, where I do think that Garvey and the Pan-African movement was respectful.
Madam C.J. Walker would be another great example of someone who was part of the Black elite, who of course was a Pan-Africanist.
Yeah.
And she donated a large amount of money to, of course, support the creation of the Negro World newspaper, Ida B. Wells as well. But people began to kind of move away from supporting him, particularly the Black elite, when there were issues in terms of how things were being implemented.
Okay, so how does that then correlate to the situation with Mr. Bishop in terms of the context that he was in, the situations, the challenges that he may have faced? How does that?
Yeah, so I mean, Grenada, for example, as we know, a small Caribbean island about 100 miles north of Venezuela. So they didn't have much industry there. Of course, there weren't a wealth of natural resources that they would be able to sell on the global market to actually raise the material conditions of the island, right, and improve the quality of life for the people. And so that played a role. And of course, Maurice Bishop and his government seeking assistance from, of course, Eastern Bloc nations. Eastern Bloc aligned nations. So, and one of the biggest goals was to, of course, refurbish the small airport that was in the country to make it a international airport. And they were going to try to use tourism as a way to, of course, build and develop the economy.
Yeah. I guess I need to do some research.
Yeah, but as you know, many Caribbean nations, the one that's small, right? So when you think about global superpowers in the world today, or your powers, you have countries like the United States, Russia, China, but these are large countries geographically, right? And so they have access to resources, foodstuffs, so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
You talk about the Caribbean; these are it's island nations, for crying out loud. So it's going to be difficult to really build a powerful nation unless you have the backing of a superpower. And of course, a good example of that would be Cuba with the Soviet Union.
Yeah, well, that brings into question, the Haitian Revolution in terms of Henry Christophe and what he was able to build in the context of an island.
Yes,
I would like to. That gives me something to research, because when you were speaking about in terms of the size and the landmass and how they would need external resources to sustain themselves, at least for the most part, that makes me question. That makes me wonder how Henry Christophe was able, at least while he was in power, to sustain the Kingdom of Haiti. In terms
right, so
of being that it was
you had the king, in the north you had the Kingdom of Haiti, and if I remember correctly, in the south you had the Republic of Haiti. So there's a couple things. One, Henry Christophe continued the economic policy of course, the St. Louverture, and that was that they re-implemented, of course, the forced labor system, right? Because they said, hey, we have to produce products to sell on the global market. Mm-hmm. And so during, of course, his time as king, what the citizenry was, of course, disenchanted with his administration and with his rule, because you had either two jobs. You could be, of course, a farmer or a soldier.
Yeah, because it's interesting you speak about that, because there are correspondence where at first it appears that Christophe tries to encourage the people to say, okay, we now have our independence. Let's get to work. And what he found is that there were certain individuals who he had appointed within the region that were mismanaging the regions that he had provided to them. So in his mind, he's like, okay, if we don't produce, if we don't build, then we are susceptible to being invaded again. So in his mind, he's reasoning, I mean, the approach that I have to take may not be ideal, but essentially, I gotta put my fist down and make this thing work, or we become vulnerable. So I don't know. Right. It's hard to gauge. Was it the same intent to? Was it a similar intent of the ones that had formerly colonized them, or was it essentially like we got to do something? We can't just sit around, and now we have to build. We've gotten our independence. Now we have to build. But certain individuals were just not in that spirit. So he kind of had to, what do you do in that situation? Do you continue to try to, pep people up to be productive? Or do you have to say, look, we either be productive or we die out? What do we do here? So that's a very tough situation that he was in.
Absolutely.
Very, very tough situation.
Absolutely.
So interesting. So what was the economic conditions of Grenada in terms of Maurice Bishop when he?
They were an impoverished nation. So let me play this once again. This brief interview about Maurice Bishop. Fair use, fair use, fair use.
In the West, and therefore a target of the Reagan administration. Joining us to talk briefly about his comrade is Bishop's former press secretary, veteran activist, and journalist Don Rojas. Don, welcome to The Real News.
Hey, thank you, Jared. Good to be with you, bro.
So let's just start with the simple question of who was Maurice Bishop, and if you can tell us a little bit about the history of Grenada to fill people in, and catch us up on who this great man was.
Sure. Well, Maurice Bishop was the leader of the People's Revolutionary Government and the head of the New Jewel movement, which was the vanguard political party that had carried out a struggle for a number of years against a dictatorship led by Prime Minister Eric Gairy. That party, in fact, overthrew the dictatorship on March the 13th, 1979, and with the support of the masses of the Grenadian people, the vast majority, took power and held on to that power for 4.5 years, right up until, as you just pointed out, October 19th, 1983, when Maurice Bishop was killed by an internal coup d'etat led by a faction of the military, of the Grenadian military. He and a number of his colleagues, ministers of government, other leaders of the New Jewel movement were assassinated. And as a result of that, pretty much the revolution imploded. So when the U.S. imperialism, looking at what was happening inside of Grenada and seizing on an opportunity to do exactly what they had been planning to do for right since 1981. In fact, they had military exercises that were carried out in Vieques Island, just off of Puerto Rico, that were in fact a dress rehearsal for an invasion of Grenada whenever the opportunity arose. And here this opportunity did arise. And under the pretext of rescuing, quote unquote, American medical students who were studying on the island at the time, the U.S. under President Reagan's command invaded Grenada and crushed the revolution, or what was left of the revolution after Bishop was killed, and occupied the country for well over a year subsequent to the invasion, thus bringing an end to an experiment, a noble experiment in self-determined political, social, and economic development led by the representatives of the Grenadian people in the form of the People's Revolutionary Government, an anti-imperialist revolution that set up upon a path of developing an independent nation that was, in fact, had become a beacon for the entire Caribbean region. So it was a great tragedy, not just for the Grenadian people, when the revolution was destroyed from within, and then on top of that, the U.S. invasion, but it was a tragedy for the entire region, because Grenada had begun to express itself as the vanguard force throughout the region, and attracted tremendous support from activists, from progressive people, particularly young people from around the country, around the Caribbean region, who came to Grenada during those years, the 4.5 years, volunteered their time and their talents and their efforts, became involved themselves in the process of building an independent nation in Grenada. And then many of them went back to pursue the struggles for independence in their own countries. It was a period 32 years ago, as you said, the anniversary just passed, that opened up a whole new chapter in the history of the Caribbean region.
Tell us a little bit about the New Jewel movement and what its goals were, what it had already successfully implemented, what made it a threat to the West and to imperialism. And we understand that Bishop was openly Marxist, and this caused problems. But tell us a little bit about how he deployed his Marxism in that region and what was being accomplished.
Well, he was a very realistic Marxist in the sense that he understood the process of dialectical and historical materialism, and that building a revolution with the involvement of the masses of the people would take time. It was a protracted process. He also understood that process would always be opposed by U.S. imperialism, given the fact that this experiment in an independent sovereign development was taking place in what the U.S. had always considered to be its backyard, the Caribbean, Latin American region, given too the whole history of U.S. imperialist interventions in our region, going all the way back to the Monroe Doctrine in the middle of the 19th century, and the invasion and occupation of places like Haiti in 1915. For 20 years, the U.S. military occupied the country of Haiti. They look at what all the attempts to overthrow the Cuban Revolution that came to power in 1959. So this particular region was a very sensitive geostrategic region for U.S. imperialism, and they vowed not to allow another Cuba to emerge and to consolidate in that region. So from the very first day of the revolution's triumph, U.S. imperialism carried out a protracted process of destabilizing the revolution, economically, politically, diplomatically, etc., to try to isolate the Caribbean, try to isolate Grenada within the Caribbean region and beyond. They were particularly upset at the close ties that had begun to develop between Grenada and Cuba, and the close personal relationship between Fidel Castro and Maurice Bishop.
So just very lastly, you know, in the moment we're in now, with Black Lives Matter, right, and police brutality here in the United States and really all around the world, actually, and a lot of young people joining movements for the first time and organization and activism for the first time, right, having your experience, because not only with this, but you have a long experience with activist politics that we would love to have another conversation with you about at some point. What does, you know, you mentioned that Bishop represented something not only for Grenada, but for the Caribbean and for international struggle. What do you think we can learn or could be passed on to young folks today, given this experience and your experience, or the particulars around Bishop's assassination, right, and his struggle, and the development of the revolution, development of ideas, or, you know, anything that you think could inform or should inform young people today from this particular experience?
Well, there's so many examples. There's so many parallels, actually, to what's happening today with the Black Lives Matter movement. The resistance to police oppression, the resistance to all forms of violence inflicted on the Black community by structural racism and institutionalized racism. Bishop, back in the day, 30 years ago, struggled against the very same forces in the context of the Caribbean region. Also, you know, you're talking about building a nation that had been for years a colony of Britain, that had achieved its nominal independence, what we call flag independence, but taking such a nation into a new stage of development that was sovereign, that was independent, that was progressive. Those are lessons, I think, that the leaders of the movement today, the Black Lives Matter movement, would do well to study some of the lessons coming out of that experience in Grenada. They are lessons of how to struggle against, you know, the various manifestations of an empire, right? I mean, the empire operating here in the United States and operating outside of the United States, very similar tactics, you know, should be studied, and there are lots of lessons that Bishop and his fellow revolutionaries have left behind for the contemporary generation of freedom fighters and resistance fighters to incorporate and to study and to build into their strategies as they move forward. So, I mean, don't forget, there's a long history of relationship between influence of freedom fighters in the United States like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and so on the revolutionary movement in the Caribbean region. There's been historical ties going all the way back to Marcus Garvey. So, you know, Marcus Garvey was from Jamaica. Marcus Garvey came to the United States and built the largest mass movement of Black people that the world had ever seen.
That's right.
Right? Yep. Then you have people like C.L.R. James from Trinidad and Tobago, brilliant Marxist revolutionary intellectual who spent a lot of time struggling and organizing workers, Black workers here in the United States, particularly in the Detroit area. So there's a whole...
And my favorite, Claudia Jones, I can shout her out real quick, too, coming from the Caribbean and doing the same kind of work. But yeah, anyway.
Exactly. I mean, there's so many examples, right?
All right, family. So yeah, just wanted to give you all some background. I hope that kind of clarified a bit about who Maurice Bishop was and the work that he was doing.
Yeah, that's it just seems like the same thing happens over and over.
Absolutely.
It's the same It's the same thing. It's like they use the same playbook, just slightly modified.
Right, absolutely. Absolutely. So Snapshot Review says, I'm listening while I'm driving, so can't tap in. I had not heard of him before. So once again, I appreciate you, Snapshot Reviews, tapping in all the way from the UK. And this is one of the reasons why, of course, we're doing this Pan-African Leadership Series. And once again, this is part 13 of nearly 200, a series of shows where we're going to be highlighting great Pan-Africanists of the past, of course, lionizing their life, their legacy, and most importantly, their work, but also studying what they've done so that we can make a better world for African people in the future. So I appreciate you tapping in and listening, Brother Snapshot Reviews. Go right ahead, Brother DOD.
Yeah, so because he was Kwame Nkrumah, I think, got independence in 57. And Bishop's, I don't know how he got. Did he come by? How did he acquire
power? Yes, it was a nonviolent coup in 79.
Okay, a nonviolent coup in 79. So, I mean, he's what? You know, it's. Did he write his own book, like his own autobiography?
I'm not familiar. I'm not sure if he wrote his own book or not, but I became aware of Maurice Bishop. I kind of in passing, of course, people would mention him while I was growing up, but of course, Brother Dwayne Omawale, who we all know is the resident historian here at Lumumba Speaks and Beacon Network, being from Guyana. And of course, Brother Dwayne is one of the preeminent scholars and historians and Pan-Africans that I know. He's written over 30 books regarding the history of African people on the continent and here in the diaspora. So he was the one who made me aware of Maurice Bishop, who he was, and of course the revolutionary Pan-Africanist government and administration that he was leading in Guyana before his assassination.
Okay. Because sometimes I wish these men would write, like, I wish they would have wrote like journals of their daily thoughts, what they were thinking, what they were facing. Because oftentimes what you find about these individuals is that their story is often written for them, and then given to us. So we don't have like an inside peek into what they're thinking and what they're dealing with on a daily basis, so that in the situation that they may be removed or they may be assassinated, we have an explanation of who they were, what they were thinking, and what their intentions were from their perspective, not from an interpretation that could fit an outside agenda.
Right.
So,
absolutely. The closest I think we have is there's a book, Maurice Bishop Speaks, that compiles 27 of his interviews and speeches covering topics like women's equality, education, religion, and the role of the U.S. in the Caribbean. So that is a book that you could purchase, Maurice Bishop Speaks.
Okay, I'll check that out.
I think that'll be. But I think another issue is oftentimes what takes place is if you're doing the work, you may not have time to do those type of things, right? You know, oftentimes we discuss why aren't there more Pan-Africanists on YouTube? And I tell people all the time, because if you're doing the work, you really don't have time to be on YouTube. I would make that argument.
Yeah, that's a conversation for another. It's just, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't expect him to write an entire memoir, but like a basic journal entry of what you're thinking, what's going on, what happened this day, just like some short synopsis, because I often find that when I'm trying to do research on a lot of these individuals, like Kwame Nkrumah, for example, perfect example. It's not a memoir, but he was able to write literature that gave us an insight to the economic infrastructure that's weaponized against African countries that seek independence.
But I think also something to consider is that Kwame Nkrumah was university educated. And Maurice Bishop was as well. I mean, he was a lawyer. But I think I just think, because, when you go to Ghana, and I've been to Ghana, and I've been to, of course, the museum, the Kwame Nkrumah Museum. But one of the things, particularly if you go to graduate school, is you're taught how to efficiently, coherently, right in a manner in which you're disseminating your ideas to the masses, right? And so I think that could play a role as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And that makes me, think about what guys in the contemporary situation with the individuals in the Sahel.
Right.
I just hope that these guys are writing their own story in some
form.
form.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with you. Yes, that way we're not in a position where, as you stated before, when they transition, and hopefully it's due to old age, not due to someone, of course, taking them before their time. There are individuals trying to make that person into what they want him to be. A good example, I think you might be familiar with the Russian activist Trotsky. Right, you have individuals trying to make Malcolm X out to be a follower of Trotsky rather than Pan-African. Yeah. So these type of things happen.
Yeah, and that's the part that frustrates me the most. It's like it's like certain like Marxism and all that type of stuff. Individuals who are Marxists, they'll try to attach themselves to like a Malcolm X or an MLK, and instead of Malcolm X being a fighter for Black liberation, he becomes a Marxist to certain individuals. Same thing with MLK. And in my mind, I was like, okay, just because he read a few books about Marxists doesn't necessarily make him a Marxist, and it's this tendency to want to attach a lot of Black figures to Marxism. I don't like that at all, because they were more than just Marxists.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, even in Islam, I had a conversation with a brother the other day because one of Malcolm's daughters had came to my hometown and was speaking. And so the brother, he's a Muslim, and he was like, I'm tired of people calling Malcolm X Malcolm X. His real name was El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. And I said, well, there's an interview where Malcolm X stated that's the name he uses in the Islamic world, but that he would continue to use the name Malcolm X for as long as the conditions that created that name still exist. And I sent him the interview where he said this. So I'm like, what are we talking about here? And he was like, but he was a Muslim. I said, well, Malcolm stated that his religion was something that was personal, that we weren't oppressed because of our religion. And he said that he was a Pan-Africanist, and he provided. So I was like, well, what are you talking about? So I actually sent the brother the interviews with Malcolm X saying this. Yeah. Right. So it's like you're trying. He was like, well, but Malcolm X is the reason why I became a Muslim. Great. But Malcolm said he was African first. Muslim second. And I said a great example of that is when you had the Zanzibar revolution, right? That took place in Zanzibar. And then they, of course, connected with Tanganyika and made Tanzania, in which, of course, most people may be unaware, but Zanzibar was one of the leading slave posts for during the Arab enslavement of African people. And when the brothers and sisters rose up against the Arab Muslim leaders of the island, Malcolm sided with the Africans, not the Muslims. So I was like, what are we talking about here? But I said, I know you don't believe me. Let me send you the interview where Malcolm X is talking about this. Right. So a lot of times it's, you know what? I don't need to study this guy. I'm going to make him or her into what I want them to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's often a huge mistake, because I'm reading I came across something where it says that the domestic factors also weighed heavily on the revolution in its final years.
Yes.
The international recession of the early 1980s impacted Grenada, as did the stuttering economies of its allies in the communist world. So that means and then it says by 1983, the party internally accepted that the revolution was no longer as popular as it had been 4 years earlier. But this was not in the first place down to the economy. At least that's what this article says. So sometimes there just may be, circumstances and conditions that are out of your control,
right,
that have a direct impact. So because I'll be honest, sometimes I lean to the side of pessimism in terms of this.
No, I understand.
It's very easy to become a pessimist once you start to look at just a constant.
Afro-pessimism is actually a school of thought in the academy. Yeah,
I've come across, but I've never looked into it. But I've heard about it, and I don't want to be a pessimist. But at the same time, I tend to look at things as they are, not how I want them to be.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I would say. You're just a realist. I don't think you're being pessimistic. I think you're a realist.
Yeah, and it's just looking at it, it's like, man, is it, because yeah, it's just the same thing over and over and over again. It's the same outcome, the same model, and they're not doing anything new. The outside forces aren't doing anything new. They're using the same strategies. They're just looking for some type of disgruntled individual that's on the inside that they can access and then give intelligence to, and somehow prepare that individual for that action to participate in the overthrow of one's own interest. Yet again.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
No, it's and I agree. Snapshot. It's definitely not designed to be easy, and it'll never be easy. It's definitely going to be a full-time thing, but at the same time, at some point there needs to be some type of working formula that at least makes these things efficient enough to sustain the first decade or so. It's like it's 5 or 10 years and then collapse. 5 or 10 years and then collapse. So it's like, sure, it's not going to be easy running a nation and running operations for any type of thing. It's never easy, but efficiency at least makes it sustainable enough to where you can see through an end goal. But it's just over and over and over. It's like, okay, are these, because I don't want to critique these guys too much, because I think context matters, but the value, but the benefit of living in the era in which we live in gives us, we have the advantage of hindsight, so we can make an analysis now with quantified, verifiable information, and you sometimes wonder, did he, again, we don't know, like, what did he read? Did he study what Kwame Nkrumah dealt with and then create measures to, expect those types of things in terms of sabotage? And again, the diaspora wasn't in a position to go in and facilitate operations.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, same thing going on with right now within the Sahel region. The diaspora can give digital likes and comments and online support, but I've yet to see, even from a Pan-Africanist standpoint, a mechanism to go in and say, hey, this is what we're willing to provide you. We have.
Right. And let me speak to that, brother. I'm glad you brought that up. That makes me think back to, and Mr. Sandman, hopefully you can tap in and be part of the conversation. Real quick, family, if you're watching, make sure you like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. You're watching, of course, LumumbaSpeaks.com, the Black Empowerment Initiative, where we believe we could gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black, in conjunction with Bequaline Network, the Pan-African social media extraordinaire, and the home of African-centered news and information. So to speak to that, brother, we talk about the diaspora. So I think many of us are familiar with the Second Italian-Ethiopian War, Abyssinian-Italian War. And there were rallies taking place here in America and really throughout the West, hands off Ethiopia. And there were African Americans who said, we're willing to go and fight in the Ethiopian army against the Italians, who were members of the Axis powers, right? The enemy. They were belligerents. And the American government said, you can't do that. Literally said, nope, you can't go fight for a foreign army. Yeah, even though you're trying to fight against the people we're fighting against.
Wow.
Yes, but during World War I, we're talking about the Harlem Hellfighters. They received, of course, the French Croix de Guerre, which was the highest military honor to bestow, right? Because when they went during World War I, America said, well, go fight with the French. Right? So at then we're limited, based on what we can do based on nationality and citizenship, or pseudo citizenship, right? Where we are now beholden to the laws of the land. Where if we actually want, or they could just say, you know what, that we view Burkina Faso as a illegitimate government, and anyone who provides resources to this government will be guilty of espionage or engaging in supporting terrorism. Now, what you gonna do?
Yeah.
So all I'm saying is that there oftentimes are structural mechanisms set in place to prohibit brothers and sisters in the diaspora, particularly here in America, from supporting movements in the Caribbean and on the continent.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mr. Sandman.
Hello, hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, sir.
Oh, yeah, how you doing, Dr. Lumumba and DOD?
What's going on, Sandman?
Hey, what does the DOD stand for? Is that like Department of Defense?
I didn't even think about that. It was just some random words I put in the name. I didn't even think about that. It's crazy.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's just her name. That's just yeah, so the topic of discussion, I just tapped in, you know what I mean? And I thought the topic of the discussion was about that I believe he's a teacher from the Caribbean. The topic of the discussion for today. What was his name again? I'm sorry.
Maurice Bishop.
Oh yeah, Maurice. Yeah. I didn't get a chance to like research a whole lot of information about him, but you know, from my understanding, he was one of those guys that was pushing education for Black people so that we can, you know, catch up with the rest of the world in regards to like being more competitive in the professional world when it comes to education. Because and I think like there was a lot of civil rights activists pushing the same agenda when it comes to like education for Black people or Black youth. Because I don't know what the demographics is or what the statistics is, but my guess is, you know, prior to the beginning of the 20th century or the 1900s, you know, probably not many people in the entire country knew how to read, and Black people were probably the lowest when it came to illiteracy in the whole entire country. So, you know, and we're gradually moving in that direction, whereas though literacy is going to be being able to read is going to be something of something that we don't really have to worry about. But he was always pushing that. A lot of, I believe, Martin Luther King was pushing that a lot as well, because Martin Luther King was talking about race this and race that, but when he started talking about the money thing, when it came to like sharing the wealth of the country with the disenfranchised Black Americans in the United States, he started talking about education equality as well, and that's why they started integrating schools, because apparently a lot of schools in predominantly African American neighborhoods were underfunded, so on and so forth. So I'm not sure where the discussion had migrated towards, but that's the most of I can recall. I mean, as a youth, when I was coming up in North Philadelphia, yeah, we had like the public schools that I went to in North Philadelphia when I was a child were pretty substandard, I would say. You know, most of us, this is in the late 80s, late 80s, early 90s. Most of us, we couldn't read, or we couldn't read on grade level. You know, and the school was full of violence. You know, fights every day. You know, some kids were, you know, held back 2-3 years, and you know, they didn't know where their parents were, or you know, they were on the streets at night, all night, you know, selling and hustling or doing whatever they were doing. So yeah, it was our school was underfunded. So to get me out of that situation, my father said, well, yeah, he's this school isn't doing my kid justice, you know what I'm saying? So he sent me to a private school, Sister Claire Muhammad in West Philadelphia, that was like safer, and you know, and
so what you're saying is you needed protection. No, I'm messing. Yeah. I'm messing with you, saying, man. I'm messing with you.
Yeah, well, Well, no, I mean, I stand up for myself. You know, if they try me, I'll fight them. You know what I mean?
No, I'm
And
just being silly. But let me do this. Because
mhm.
you talked about this vicious cycle, right? And oftentimes when we talk about, restoring ourselves to traditional greatness, when people talk about education, the conversation typically centers on learning one's history, heritage, and culture. We know this has been popularized in the Nation of Islam, i.e., the idiom knowledge of self, right? But I go beyond that, right? Yes, we know part of education is knowing who you are, where you come from, having pride in who you are. But also, I argue gaining tangible skills that will allow you to be able to make a living, right? And so Malcolm X talked about this vicious cycle of poverty. So I'm gonna play this clip. Malcolm X speaking about that. Then we're gonna get back to Maurice Bishop, and then we will close out.
The Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us that our people are scientifically maneuvered by the white man into a life of poverty. Because we are forced to live in the poorest sections of the city, we attend inferior schools, we have inferior teachers, and we get an inferior education. The white power structure downtown makes certain that by the time our people do graduate, we won't be equipped or qualified for anything but the dirtiest, heaviest, poorest paying jobs that no one else wants. We are trapped in a vicious cycle of economic, intellectual, social, and political death. Inferior jobs, inferior housing, inferior education, which in turn again leads to inferior jobs. We spend a lifetime in this vicious circle, or in this vicious cycle going in circles, giving birth to children who see no hope or future but to follow in our miserable footsteps.
So, I just play that because I think it highlights, of course, what we're talking about. And this is an example of, once again, organic intellectualism. You don't have to read a book to know that this is what's taking place. It's called observable reality, what some people call empirical research or data, right? And so I just want to give a shout out to you, Brother Sandman, for highlighting that. This is why we see in many of these revolutionary movements that were taking place. We talk about Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso. We talk about Nkrumah in Ghana. We talk about, of course, it was extremely short-lived, Lumumba's Congo, right? In Nyeri's Tanzania, right? And Kenyatta's Kenya, right? This focus on, of course, literacy, right? Literacy, right? The ability to become educated, to become well-read, so that one can acquire a meaningful employment, so they can have a better quality of life. So I'm just appreciative that you were able to tap in and bring that to the forefront of some of the work that we're doing to, of course, help restore people to our traditional greatness.
Yeah, and I just want to comment on what Brother Malcolm was speaking on there. When he uses the word poverty, he also again relates poverty not just to financial, not just to the financial aspect, but again speaking to what Mrs. Sandman was saying, to the literacy aspect of it as well, because you could be poor in terms of a literate sense, not just financially. And I think literacy is what ultimately, it's by far one of the easiest ways, or how can I put it? Literacy is probably one of, at least in my opinion, this is just from my observation, it's probably one of the easiest ways for an outside entity to infiltrate a population. Because if the people are not literate, they don't have the capacity to discern, right? So
President Douglas talks about that in his autobiography.
Yeah, so it's one thing to be able to just pronounce words and pronounce parts of speech, but it's another thing to be able to actually comprehend what's being communicated to you, and then take that information that's being communicated to you, dissect it, and then draw a conclusion from it. Those are two completely different things. And ultimately, once you have a population of people that they can read or have basic reading or basic writing skills or basic literacy, and then they're up against individuals that have, I don't want to say it in a condescending way, but are more literate in simplest ways. It's clear who has the advantage in that situation, right?
Yes, sir.
So when we continue to see these patterns of, just there'll be some type of revolution 5-10 years and it'll sputter. Some type of revolution 5-10 years and it'll sputter. Revolution in 5 or 10 years and it'll sputter and collapse altogether. I think, to what Malcolm X was saying, literacy plays a key role in one's ability to continue to be taken advantage of. It's like, and I'll end here after this basic example.
No, brother, you cooking. Go right ahead.
Imagine you have a man that can't count, right? He can't count money, and he has a family member that may be sending him resources and money to take care of himself and to help him get on his feet, but he can't count. And he has someone else that counts the money for him. And that person who's counting the money for him realizes how much it is. And he just decides, to give him a few dollars, but then he tells him it's more than what it's actually worth. Unless the individual learns how to count, he will continuously be taken advantage of. And so with the perpetual losses that Africans keep taking over and over and over and over and over again, it makes you wonder, like, how much of this is a literacy issue rather than incapable, or because I genuinely believe that Africans or Black people in the diaspora around the world, they are more than capable of taking control of their own destiny. But yes. But in order to do that, you have to understand who you are dealing with so you can effectively prepare. And the only way that you can understand who you're dealing with is if you have the literacy and the ability to comprehend and analyze who you're dealing with, and which then allows you to prepare effectively. So
I would agree.
So literacy, I especially believe that literacy for our context is even far more important, because we have access to way more information than individuals in the past had, yet we have yet to build anything that can supersede what they did with less information. Right. You would think with 5 to 10x the technology, we would see 5 to 10x the productivity amongst Black people around the planet, but you don't see that. People like slaves would literally be killed for reading. Yeah. Now you have to drag people to pick up a book.
And brother, like I said, you're cooking with fish grease. So I'm gonna tap in and I'm gonna let you go ahead, Brother Sandman. Part of the issue, in my opinion, this is opinion based. This is an issue isn't a statement of fact. Is there's been a cultural shift in our community. If you think about it, there was a time, Brother DOD, and we know that doesn't stand for Department of Defense, right? But there was a time in our community where if you were a school teacher, that was a position of prestige in our community. There was a time in our community that the person who was the most popular in school had the best grades. Think about this. So there's been a cultural shift. I have a position regarding when the cultural shift took place and why, but of course I'm going to, pass it to Brother Sandman.
Okay.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you guys. That shift happened. When we go on this this memory train, or this train down in history, and we look at like our forefathers during the civil rights movement that were pushing this literacy thing and education for Black people to get us out of the ghetto. It's amazing how out of nowhere, I guess around in the 90s, that the ghetto started to get glamorized in the media, whether it be in TV or in music. So it became uncool to be educated, and it became cool to be ignorant. And I don't know how that happened, but it seems to be that was the objective of what happened to us in the 80s and moving into the 90s. But I don't want to move too far away from the topic at hand, but I always wondered, like, why do you think our ancestors in West Africa, we didn't tend to develop written languages to pass down information, as opposed to just bringing down information to the next generation verbally?
Well, there was a mixture of both. There was oral tradition, but there also was written information as well. A good example of that would be when we cite the Constitution of the Mali Empire. And that, of course, it's the Kurgan Fuga, right? That was in writing. So there was a mixture there. Real quick, Mark states, there is no Pan-African future. That train left the station decades ago. Please comment. So Mark, I appreciate you tapping in. I appreciate you providing a disagreement. If you could tap in, if you could be part of the conversation, the link is in the description. I'll put the link in the chat once again. Tap in and be part of the conversation once again. As you know, you do not have the camera up, and you can continue to use a pseudonym to be part of the conversation. Now, I would love for you to tap in and share with us why you believe Pan-Africanism has no future. Tell us why you believe the train left the station and what is the solution. So if we're pivoting, if your argument is, and of course I'm paraphrasing here, but if you're asking us to pivot from Pan-Africanism, what do we turn to as the vanguard ideology for Black liberation, Black improvement, Black self-determination? So once again, Mark, if you can, please tap in and be part of the conversation. Brother Sandman, Brother DOD, what is your response to Mark's comment?
Is Pan-African dead or is past? I mean, no, it's not. Pan-Africanism is and getting rejuvenated because of our ability to be able to touch each other instantly, you know, via the internet or on the phone that we couldn't do in the past. So we can talk to like people from all over the world, all over the diaspora all over the world, and talk to them and get their influence and get their point of view. So it's a transition from where we were doing in the past, where we had to actually travel to the Caribbean to see Marcus, or travel all the way to the Congo to see Lumumba, or now we can just speak to them, you know, virtually online. So I think it can be rejuvenated. I think it will be rejuvenated, and I think it's moving in a proper direction at the present time. I just think organically we have to just, you know, keep hacking away at it and allow it to grow.
Brother DOD, what say you?
Now I think about this question a lot. I don't think that the spirit of Pan-Africanism in terms of the hearts of the people is dead, right? Because it's an idea is intangible, right? So you can't really kill an idea, right? You can't, you know, the same way that you can't destroy white supremacy as an ideology, because that ideology is in the hearts of minds of millions of people. The same thing with Pan-Africanism as an idea. You can't kill an idea. It's something that exists in the mind. So I think that will always be there. But Pan-African in terms of a competing economic, political mechanism on the world stage, that's on life support, in my opinion. And that's not being a pessimist in the sense that I wish that was not the case. But from my observation, I think that part of Pan-Africanism is it's because I don't know if you remember the first time I asked you, the first time I came on a live stream here a while ago, was about, do you think Pan-Africanism could ever be resuscitated? And you've even mentioned that it was on life support. I don't know if I can remember that correctly.
Yes, you're remembering correctly. That is exactly what I said. At the time, I said it was on life support. Now, I would say this: we are seeing a resurgence of Pan-Africanism, particularly in the Caribbean and on the continent. I would say that.
Yes, and the resurgence is there, but we also have to keep in context is that what's going to happen with Pan-Africanism in the future is, I think the future of Pan-Africanism, if it's not defended, it will be co-opted. And what I mean by the co-opting of it is, it's similar to what right-wing conservatives did with the word woke, right? It was traditionally a colloquial term in which Black people used amongst themselves. They took the word, they bastardized it, they redefined it, and they retooled it to now become a pejorative. Because what a lot of people don't know is that there are Western companies, Western banks specifically, and I have the name of the bank on the tip of my tongue, but it can't come to memory right now. They actually use Pan-African language in their messaging. So you have European companies, Western companies, specifically banks, that are on the continent of Africa, providing financial services, who are using the language of Pan-Africanism in their messaging in terms of the service that their bank provides. So as what we would call, quote unquote, traditional Pan-Africanists speak about Pan-Africanism, there's an ongoing strategy on the continent to redefine what Pan-Africanism means. And for me, there's two sides to Garvey. And obviously he's one of many within the historical tract of Pan-Africanism. There's two sides to Garvey. You have the ideological side of Pan-Africanism, and then you have the geopolitical, economic side of Pan-Africanism. And when you look at Garvey, he's advocating for the ideology, but then he's also trying to build an economic network amongst Black people so they can compete on the world stage.
That's why he created the Black Star Line of steamships to compete against Europe's White Star Line of steamships. If many of you are unaware, and I can ask you the question for the BOD, what was the flagship ship of the White Star Line British cruise line company?
I have no clue.
It was the Titanic.
Oh yeah, White Star Line, yeah, Titanic.
Yep, it was the Titanic, absolutely. And so he created Black Star Line, and the goal was to, of course, engage in commerce and trade and travel between, of course, Africa, the U.S., and of course the Caribbean for African people. So you're absolutely on point there. Another point I want to raise, and I'm glad you brought this up, is we tend to find this with individuals who are opposed, of course, to Pan-Africanism, is the individuals who are opposed to it haven't developed any real movement of their own to help, of course, restore African people, Black people in any way, tangible manner, right? And we talk about the co-opting of Pan-Africanism, when you brought this up. That's why I let you cook, because you was cooking with fish grease. Is we've seen this with Tariq Nasheed, right? The co-opting of Pan-Africanism when it was financially expedient for him to do so, right? He created the 1804, of course, documentary highlighting the success and the preeminence and prominence and importance of the Haitian Revolution. Many who are well-versed in the Haitian Revolution know that the success of the Haitian Revolution is what created the movement and ideology that we know and call Pan-Africanism, right? However, what we find is now he's lambasting and denigrating Haitians as trying to, live off our legacy, eat off our legacy, right? So this is the situation, once again, where someone is able to come in and grift, come in and, of course, as you stated before, of course, use Pan-Africanism, manipulate Pan-Africanism for their own personal benefit.
And to be fair, Tariq Nasheed is a very he's an asterisk in this whole conversation. He's something that you can glance over and say, he says all these types of things, and I think he plays a critical role in the disinformation and furthering division.
That's true.
But in the grand scheme of the history of Pan-Africanism and Garvey and what he's trying to build, he's very he's more of a pest, if you will. If I can say.
I got you. But the point I was just trying to make is, of course, as you stated, there are individuals who come in and seek to, of course, manipulate Pan-Africanism for our own personal benefit. Right?
Yeah, and co-op. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Co-opt it, yes. And the other issue, of course, is when you have individuals, and I've always provided space. We know one of the core tenets of the Movement Speaks and Be Quiet Network is, of course, a diversity of thought. So we've always advocated for brothers and sisters. If you disagree, you can come on here and we can have the conversation. Don't have a problem with that. We just argue you can't make claims that are averse to facts, right? But you could come on here and you could be part of the conversation. The issue is individuals typically aren't willing to have a conversation. And a few times, I think only twice in the entire time that I've had this platform, when an individual did come on and disagree with Pan-Africanism, they made claims that were ahistorical. So their basis for disagreeing with Pan-Africanism was based on, once again, misinformation.
Yeah. a lot of misinformation, which goes back again to what
right, or simply anti-Africanist, just self-hatred. I don't want to have anything to do with Africa.
Yeah.
Right. So these are things to consider. That was a situation when I had that conversation with Afro Elite, where he was like, well, why do we have to call it Pan-African? Well, one, so I remember, and I'm glad you brought this up, brother. So we're discussing Pan-Africanism. He said that he felt Pan-Africanism was obsolete, and he said that we should just start calling things B1. I said, well, why? He said, well, I think B1 is a more efficient term, and that we can organize and operate ourselves based on the race first. And I said, well, you do know that's what Pan-Africanism is. So I said, so you do agree with Pan-Africanism, you just want to just call it something different. Right? So it was like, what are we talking about here?
And for me, I think what's going to need to be done in the future is there needs to be like a clear definition, because I've had a hard time trying to figure out what a clear definition of what Pan-Africanism is.
Okay.
From the outside looking in, because I'm still fairly new to all of this. It's not something that I've been like this like Pan-Africanism as a concept. This isn't something that I was like, a family tradition or anything like that. Right. This is something as I've grown older and I've read history and I've had to analyze, like, why is the position of African people around the world in this condition? Mm-hmm. And that led me on a journey of trying to figure out what in the world is going on, which eventually led me to Garvey, and then that opened up a whole that opened up an entire Pandora's box, and then it led me to trying to figure out what panic. So I'm still kind of new to this thing, trying to figure out exactly what it is. But a few questions that come to mind, and then we'll close because I know you're on the schedule here, is that one of the main questions I have about Pan-Africanism is that it was never really able to like take its proper footing or get to an altitude to where it could cruise in our modern terms, meaning it's always more so it strives to build something that can eventually get to altitude and cruise. More so it tries to take off and it tries to catch flight, and it does a little bit, and then it may have to do an emergency landing, or it tries to take off and then in some instances a crash. And so what I'm, at least from my current understanding of from what I've read so far, is that I don't even think Pan-Africanism has ever, been in a position to where it actually had sustained operations for more than a decade or 20 years or 30 years or 40 years in terms of an institution per se, So I'm more of the persuasion is, has it even been built to its final form yet to where you can say, okay, bam, this is Pan-Africanism here. So
let me respond to that. I'm glad you brought this up. So I think there's a couple of things. One, there have been several iterations of Pan-Africanism, right? When we talk about Pan-Africanism and its emphasis, it was an advocacy for repatriation, right? Mm-hmm. African people have repatriated. I don't know if you've been to the continent, but if you go there, you will find brothers and sisters here in the diaspora on the continent, living, working, fellowshipping, of course, on a diurnal basis, right? Mm-hmm. Second, there was an advocacy for self-governance, political self-determination, particularly not only here in the Caribbean, but also, of course, on the continent as well. That was accomplished. That was achieved, or as the brother stated, who was, of course, Brother Bishop's press secretary, nominal independence, right? Flag independence. And now there's a fight for economic independence. So one of the things we have to understand is that, of course, anti-Black racism is intransigent, right? So it's going to mutate, right, based on the conditions to continue to keep Black people in a position in which we're subordinate globally, not just in a particular nation or locale or metropolitan area. Mm-hmm. And so now part of the fight not only is for economic independence, but also for good governance, right? One of the reasons I changed my profile picture on Instagram and then, of course, on Facebook, and I'm going to do the same on Twitter, is to highlight the issue taking place in Togo right now, right? We have this repressive dictatorship that's been in power for almost 50, 60 years. So we find that Pan-Africanism has accomplished several goals, but now the push now is for, of course, economic independence, and of course, what good governance. And we know that the enemies of African people globally are not going to relinquish economic independence, because that means that they will be relinquishing their real perceived financial privilege that they have in the global north.
Yeah. You know, one thing I'd like to ask is that I don't know if you would ever be up to this, but it's like, I think there needs to be like someone who's well versed in this topic that could give like an extensive lecture mapping it out in terms of its history, because I think there needs to be like some type of standard in terms of what this thing is, and then we could point to a resource that could, hey, this is probably an exhaustive, definitive understanding of what Pan-Africanism is. Because if you don't have that standard unit of measurement in terms of standard definition of what something is, then everyone will just go and create their own definitions and their own interpretations of what it is. And then it ends up becoming, you know, smorgasbord of differing opinions and different definitions of what Pan-Africanism actually is. Because to me, at least the way that I see it, there's an ideological side of it, and then there's a political side of it, and then there's an economic side of it. There's three.
Yes, and there are core tenets to Pan-Africanism as well, right? So yes, part of that is advocating for social, political, and economic independence, right? We understand that there's an ideology of racial pride, you know, being African-centered, self-determination, self-defense, so on and so forth. But when we talk about core tenets, one of the core tenets of Pan-Africanism is, of course, anti-miscegenation. Right? And this isn't something that someone who simply has an issue with Black people dating out has. You know, this dates all the way back to the first written Pan-Africanism Manifesto, which of course was David Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the world, particularly those in the United States of America, written in 1829, Boston, Massachusetts. Right? And so but I mean, I could send you literature, of course, on Pan-Africanism, one of the core tenets, you know, so on and so forth, if you would like to ingratiate yourself in that manner.
Yeah. So, because I'm just trying to figure out, like, what's the play now for Pan-Africanism? Like, in its contemporary construct.
And that's what I said. Part of it is what? Advocacy for good governance, right? And of course, economic independence. That's the play now.
But what do you think the other side is playing for? So
what do you mean?
So, for example,
what do you say other
side? The neo-colonial infrastructure, per se, the neo-colonial power structure, because the same way that
their economic, social, and political hegemony.
Yeah. So, because how can I put it? Basically, what I'm asking is it's just a lot. I need to think about this. This gives me something to research, because there's a lot of questions that are coming to mind now that I don't want to, you know, keep being so long with it. But I just got a lot of stuff I need to research.
So, you know, I could do a show on what is Pan-Africanism. I mean, I've kind of done a show on this before, but we could do that.
I'll look on your channel to see if there's a stream or something.
Yeah. Actually, so if you go on my channel, in fact, I will share my screen and show you, because we have a number of playlists on my channel, and I can bring that up for you and show you where on the playlist we cover this information. The reason why I did this is because, unfortunately, a lot of people are unaware, right? So we said, okay, this would give us an opportunity to provide this information for brothers and sisters. So let me share my screen here, and you will be made avail yourself of this information. So if you go on my channel, go to playlist, of course, and we have this playlist here, Pan-Africanism, right? Of course, we have the Pan-African Leadership Series here, Traditional African Religions, Nation of Islam, Carter Community, Abrahamic Religions. But you go right here to Pan-Africanism, and what your religions is, see, you can scroll down here, addressing the current state of Pan-Africanism. So we did a show on that, right? Addressing the current state of Pan-Africanism. Let's see here.
I think I watched that one. What is your beef with Pan-Africanism?
Yes.
and then the one with you and Dynasty Man. I think I watched
yes.
that.
Well, yes. And so here's the show here. What are the core tenets of Pan-Africanism?
Okay. All right.
Yes. So you can check that show out. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, it's dang, man. Because yeah. Because I think sometimes I think Pan-African
2 years ago. 2 years. I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but yeah,
no,
it was 2 years ago that we actually did this show. I'm sorry, that is Honoring the Life and Legacy of Thomas and Carr. So 2 years ago, we did the show, of course, what are the core tenets of Pan-Africanism. We did the shows, of course, to really push back against misinformation about Pan-Africanism.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, because I'm far more interested in the strategies and the approach that could ultimately lead to the end goal. Because I think without a proper framework of Pan-Africanism, because there are other groups of people and other entities that are also competing for the same turf.
Absolutely.
Right. So the neo-colonial power structure, the neo-imperialist power structure, they are also competing for control of the mines, the resources, trade lines, value chains on the continent of Africa. So I'm far more interested in Pan-Africanism as an ideology as it relates to the competing entities who are all engaged on the same field per se, right? So you got Team A, Team B, and Team C, who are all, competing for very different reasons. So for us, or for not us, but for some Black people, Pan-African may be, we need to come together and unify. But for the outside entity is, we're trying to control as many resources as possible and as many value chains as possible.
And if I could, but this is what I say to people say we need to unify. I say, okay, unify to do what? We can't just have unity just for the sake of having unity. It needs to be purposeful. It needs to be what? Meaningful, and it needs to bring about a desired, tangible result.
And that's why for me, it's unless Black people across the planet control their resources and the means of production, 50 years from now, there's going to be some young adult who'll be on YouTube questioning the same thing.
Absolutely.
Because ultimately power boils down to the resources and the means of productions in which you control.
Absolutely.
And whoever controls the means of production, whoever controls infrastructure, that's who has power. So when I look at Pan-Africanism, I'm looking at Pan-Africanism mostly from the perspective of how do we develop a framework and a worldview that gives us a trajectory to get to a position where the means of production, resources, and value chains go back into the hands of its rightful owners.
Right. And a great example of that, of course, is what's being done in Burkina Faso right now with Captain Ibrahim Traoré.
Yeah. So I'll just end it there.
Yeah, so you'll land there. SSR from across the pond. What's the word, my good brother?
Good evening. Good evening.
Oh, snapshot. I was wondering where that was.
So I tapped out a little bit just after when you started to say you had noticed there's a culture shift amongst the diaspora in terms of like people not valuing education and things. And I just got back 2 months ago from Zimbabwe, and it's a little bit more, it's a bit deeper than just a culture shift. It's almost like ever since certain African people laid eyes on white people or Europeans, it's like they automatically stopped thinking for themselves. I was learning about stories about this young English guy called Salou. He was like 22 years old, traveled from Great Britain to the land we now know as Zimbabwe. And basically while he's there, and he's just 22 years old, he's mapped out all the routes around this this land, where you can take your wagons as far as you can take them, best places to hunt, all of that stuff. The blueprint for the roads there are based on the routes that he's mapped out. And the Africans that were there were just following him around because he had like a gun and weapons and stuff, but he would shoot an elephant, or he would shoot, there'd be loads of game that they could get because he's hunting while he's going around. And it's almost like they're just sitting there doing nothing, waiting for these people to tell them what to do. And a lot of the, fast forward to today, a lot of the African leaders seem to be running their administrations as if it's a monarchy, and that's not what it's supposed to be. Therefore, they're appointing their sons, their nephews, their uncles, their brothers into positions that they're not qualified to do because it's not based on merit. And when you have an impoverished population of people and you can approach the leader and say, hey, I'll keep you rich, you just keep doing this, this, and this, and I'll make sure you're all right. They're going to work in a way to keep their interests the way they are, which is why I believe every African leader over the age of 55 needs to just retire, because it's the young people that are starved of these opportunities. It's the young people that are thinking, why are we settling for this deal and this deal? But these older heads, they're so used to that system and not having to think for themselves. They don't want to give it up. And one of the agenda points for Pan-Africanism, the first step, we got to clean up our own house before we step out. We can't be, it's hard to go into the, what, you know, it's like sometimes it feels like you're on a football team and you're getting tackled by the people on the same team. Do you know what I mean? Like, you're trying to score goals against the opposition, but you got your midfielder or your striker is tackling you while you're trying to score goals. So until we start to think about what we're doing in terms of like how we sort it out internally, it's always going to be stifled, because you're going to come up against people that are supposed to be on your team that are going to be manipulative and stuff to undermine it so that they can keep whatever they got going on. And it's not going to work like that. Literally, just like you go into a meeting and there's a meeting agenda, there needs to be an agenda for this thing. And for Pan-Africanists, or for the African diaspora as a whole, there needs to be one or two key things where you, Dr. Lumumba in LA, it resonates with you, and it also resonates with me in the UK, and it also resonates with DOD wherever you are in the world. And then you can build upon it to make it more regional focused if you want to, but that's for you in your region and wherever you are. But there needs to be 1, 2, 3 at most key things that every African that subscribes to Pan-Africanism has to sign up to towards what we're working towards doing. And perhaps those 9 areas of activity that Neely Fuller Jr. identified in his book, maybe that's a starting point. Maybe it's mapping out strategies for how we become a competitive force in those 9 areas. And maybe it's just starts from there and rolls out. But until we identify an agenda, we're just fumbling in the dark here, trying to work out what works and what doesn't work. And these other groups who have already got their game plan together are already running laps around us.
And, you know, it's interesting you speak about that guy who went and mapped Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
Because I think that's a very that plays a very important role in the overall goal of what they were attempting to accomplish, right? You go in, you survey the area, you make an analysis of the situation, you look at what's happening, what caused it, and then from there you could draft an analysis which then leads you to come up with probable solutions for the end goal. And I think ultimately, if there's not a clear enough, succinct goal of what Pan-Africanism is attempting to achieve, then, like you said, we'll just be running in circles here. And I believe ultimately, if I had to use one word to sum up what I personally believe Pan-Africanism is, I think for me, it just boils down to one word: ownership. Period. ownership, because once you get ownership, then you can have sovereignty. Then you can have true independence. Then you can actually have true power. Power comes through ownership. You know, you never see billionaires on the street protesting policies that may negatively impact. They use power to their advantage to leverage and leverage that to get their outcome. But going back to that guy who surveyed that area,
yeah,
I'd like to use that analogy to say is, what are Pan-Africanists surveying? What are they analyzing? What are they looking at? What are we looking at and saying, all right, this may be an angle here, or this is the end goal? What is that thing? And for me, I think it's simple. So for example, right now in China, there were certain things that you cannot do in China in terms of economics, right? You cannot buy agricultural land in China. You can't. I've went to these real estate websites where they have houses for sale and all these type of things. You cannot buy agricultural land as an outsider in China.
Okay, and that's the case
in
Africa too. But real quick, brother, I want to chime in. And you stated that. So, for example, one, in most African nations, if you are a foreigner, you can't buy property there. That's just reality. But you said billionaires, you don't find them protesting, and that's true. But they typically protest in different ways. One, they pay other people to go out and protest, right? They create proxy organizations. And the second issue is they engage in what's known as, in politics, is when people are lobbyists. They have lobbyists who do their bidding for them. So they protest just in different ways.
Correct.
Yeah, but also let me just take a slight step backwards when you were talking about ownership. That's part of it, I agree with, but ownership without vision or direction is useless. And I'll use the same example that I used again. When Sulu was walking around Zimbabwe, there was a chief called, I think his name was Lebengula. I think that was his name was. He basically was a splinter off branch off of what Shaka Zulu had created in his Zulu war machine, right? But this guy was, you'd have to wait. Sometimes you'd have to wait like 2 weeks or so just to have an audience with him to get permission to go into the lands to look around and stuff. And if you were caught doing anything other than what you said you was doing, you got in trouble. But his captains and his scouts are telling him this is what they're doing, and he's still just sitting there like he doesn't know what to do about the situation. Do you know what I mean? Because he had no vision. He wanted to write letters to Queen Victoria asking her what he should do about the British people that are walking up and down the lands and this, that, and the other. And they used to call them Mzungu, which means just wandering around aimlessly. But they weren't wandering around aimlessly. They were clearly planning stuff out. But I don't know. Just what brings me back to what I said earlier. There are some people within the diaspora, whether they are whether they've had their history interrupted by the transatlantic slave trade or whether they've stayed on the continent, that as soon as they come into contact with European, they just stop thinking for themselves.
It's like,
and I don't know what you do to undo it. The younger generation
we can't save everyone, but that's why there's an addition to just ownership, and you need to be black-minded. Maybe you can add that to. I mean that's part of it. As I say, one of the core tenets of Pan-Africanism is racial pride and Afrocentrism. So I mean, this isn't a need to redefine Pan-Africanism, but respectfully, Brother DOD, I would implore you to actually read up on, of course, the history of Pan-Africanism and what the core tenets are. And one of the ways you could do that, of course, is, watching my YouTube channel and the video that we did 2 years ago. And even though I'm not typically an advocate of people watching YouTube, like getting an education from the University of YouTube,
you got it.
But in that video, if I remember correctly, of course it was 2 years ago, I'm actually citing my sources. I pulled the books off the shelf, right, which Snapshot Reviews knows I'm aching to do, right? I pull the books off the shelf and then go over that information. So everything you're mentioning already exists.
So let me just clarify one thing that you spoke to there. I'm not necessarily attempting to redefine it. I'm just trying to figure out where the orientation is. That's all.
Right.
I'm not trying to reinvent
and as I stated, Pan-Africanism has gone through a number of iterations, right? It began with Africans here in the diaspora longing for the homeland. So one of the primary, in its infancy, the primary goal of Pan-Africanism was repatriation to the African continent.
Yeah.
Right. That was achieved, right? Starting with Paul Kufi, right? Second, it became an advocacy for political independence. That was accomplished. As I stated, the brother who was the press secretary for our great ancestor, Maurice Bishop, stated, but that was nominal independence. Now the advocacy is for what? Economic independence. And of course, good governance, because this is the issue we even have here in the States amongst, Black politicians, or even in the UK, where you have Black politicians who are doing the bidding in the power structure and not serving working in terms or on the behalf of their constituents. Right. So this is where it is now, what economic independence and of course, good governance.
For me, I'm just trying to identify how, as an everyday person who doesn't have a huge platform, who's not a politician, who's not a world leader, how can I play an active part in helping to move this thing forward?
Exactly.
Absolutely. So, and that's something, something we talked about, I think, on the last show. DOD used the term, of course, how do we scale this? And I said that one of the easiest ways, it's twofold. One of the easiest ways is having a functional family unit, right? Yeah. Right. We know the most important institution in any community is the family unit. So if you're developing and raising well-balanced, Black-minded children, that's a benefit to the community. The second is one of the simplest things you could do is put together a Juma Mosi Shule, which of course is Kiswahili for Saturday school.
I'd like to add one last thing before we close, and I'll be done. Is it possible? Is it reasonable to at least suggest that the reason why Garveyism was able to grow so rapidly in the United States of America is because if we look at the historical context of Garvey, your opponent is clear, it's well defined, their intentions are known.
Facts.
Therefore, the context of the situation where you have a clear opponent, the measures in which they are willing to use to accomplish and maintain their power, therefore, it solicits a response necessary to deter or overcome that. So within the context of where we are now, it's not as blatant. It's not as obvious. It's more subversive. It's more passive, aggressive. It's not overt. So therefore, so even though the end goal may be the same, the mechanisms and the approaches in which they are using to attain that power are not as overt and they are not as direct. Therefore, the response to their actions is just more of a passive one. It's more observatory in a sense, rather than within the context of Garvey, people are being lynched, Black people are being sabotaged politically, there's violence, there's exploitation, there's laws literally prohibiting Black people across the nation to even prosper economically. So that requires a much more visceral response. Whereas now it's more so we'll draft a policy to exploit you, but we'll cloud it or we'll muddy the waters in so much legal jargon that you don't even know we're exploiting you. So therefore you think nothing is happening. All I'm saying is that the context of where Garvey is in requires a response that was so strong and so forward that maybe since the opponents are not so overt, this is the response you get within within the contemporary context, at least.
Well, absolutely. And you think about it, outside of Ethiopia, Black people lack political self-determination globally, right? So that's an issue. Also, just want to kind of, clear some things up. One of the misnomers is that Garvey did not have a successful organization until he came to the United States. That actually isn't true. One of the reasons he went to the United States, particularly to New York City, was one, he wanted to, of course, meet Booker T. Washington, but Booker T. Washington had transitioned a year prior. The other issue was he went to New York City because they were having issues in the UNA office in New York City, and that they asked him to stay, and that's why he did, right? But of course, he had made connections in the Caribbean. Of course, I think Cuba had the second largest number of Garvey offices in the Caribbean. I mean, so you know that's a misnomer. But yes, part of it is because anti-blackness was far more visceral than it is today, right? And another issue we find is, of course, most Black people are, of course, they have an intersectional approach to identity, where the focus is now on gender identity, sexual orientation, so on and so forth, right? So their racial identity isn't their most salient identity. This is something I write about in my dissertation, and that this has an adverse effect on Black community building, development, and then of course maintaining or sustaining whatever initiatives we actually create.
Yeah, because Snapshot made an interesting point about that king, when that guy is coming in there and he's doing all these observations in Zimbabwe, the king is just looking at him. There's no, but had he known the intentions of the individual, maybe it would have elicited a different response. You know, we never know.
Well, to be honest, he's a splinter group of the Zulu fighting force that fought against the British in South Africa. So he would have had some indication of what type of time they're on. And the thing is, right, if I'm totally honest, since being on the continent, I wouldn't have any issues with, if I was like back then, like a chief or whatever, I wouldn't have any issues with people from other parts of the world coming to my land and setting up some stuff for themselves, as long as whatever international trade they're doing, based on what they're planting and what they're growing on here, we have some sort of equitable deal that you can farm and you can earn money doing that, and you take care of the export part of it. And heck, I might even provide you with some people that are looking for work to help you build that up, as long as there is a fair and equitable transfer of business, not this whole stuff that we see where they come through, take over all of this stuff, but
that's how it starts, though,
on the dollars and all of that stuff. But the world is global, right? Like it's very, it's especially now, especially in this day and age, it's going to be very hard for people to be isolationists or by themselves. People are going to have to integrate with, do commerce and do business with other groups, and I'm not opposed to that. I just want to make sure that it's a fair and even exchange. But obviously, capitalism in its purest form doesn't allow for that, and colonialism doesn't allow for that. It's that colonialist mentality or that supremacist mentality that I would want to get rid of.
But
that's just wishful. That might just be wishful thinking. You know what I mean?
I want to challenge the statement that you said you would allow people to come in and as long as it's equitable. And I would argue that's how it initially starts, until you no longer have no pieces on the chessboard. So it starts off as this what appears to be a fair exchange, and then over time, due to the lack of due diligence on behalf of different groups of people, over time, what becomes this fair exchange slowly encroaches on your sovereignty, slowly encroaches on your independence, to the point where you look, what started off as fair is now complete and total monopoly. So, for example, when you look at the way in which the Chinese interacted with the Europeans, they interacted with the European on a completely different way. There's this story of this one individual coming from Europe where he goes to China and he wants to open up trade routes in China. And he thinks he's just going to go to China and then just walk in there and get a meeting with the king of that specific dynasty. Well, he doesn't. They keep him at a port, and they make him wait there for months. And then he eventually gets a meeting with the king, and he has to travel through mainland China. And he's traveling through mainland China with an envoy of Chinese military generals watching his every move as he's moving through China. until he gets to his meeting with the king. And then
Right.
the king, and then the Chinese king eventually says, you know what, we're not interested. You can leave now. And then those Chinese generals march him all the way back through China, back to that port, and make sure that he leaves that region. So
Right.
the way that
so the difference between that and what happened in Zim was basically these guys are just letting these people come into the land, and they're not even monitoring them. They're not watching what they're doing or anything like that. I'm not proposing that. I'm not proposing that at all. I'm talking about like, okay, we got this, this, and this. You've got access to this market which I can't reach. So therefore, we'll give you A, B, and C. You go out there and sell it because you got your connections with those people, and then we both eat. If he doesn't come back with the money, he ain't getting a harvest next season. It's as simple as that. But these chiefs, I'm telling you, it's almost like they took their. It's almost as though as soon as they saw the European, they took their brains out of their heads and put it in their back pocket. And I hate to say this because I wasn't thinking like this before I went out there, but I have to see. I have to be fair enough to look at the situation as it is, not as I would want it to be. You know what I'm saying? So, like, there is a lot of psychological hurdles the diaspora still has to get over. We can't just shortcut it to the end goal. Do you know what I mean? Without sorting that out. Malcolm said something interesting that when he was in prison, he was reading up about the Chinese Revolution. I'm not suggesting this at all, right? But and I don't want to say anything that's gonna mess up Dr. Lumumba's channel. But if you look into that thing, you'll see what measures that nation made to make sure that everyone was on code. And there isn't. That's why I say, like, we need a mantra or an agenda that everyone agrees to, which has one or two things. Because if it's any more than that, it's gonna cause division, it's gonna cause arguments, whatever. Just one or two simple things that we're all aiming towards, and then you go make it work in the best way you can in your region. I'll make it work for the best way that I can in my region. Dr. Lumumba makes it work for the best way he can in his region. And hopefully both hands will wash each other and both hands will wash the face. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. That's it. I learned a lot today. I learned about how much I don't know, for sure. Because
every day's a learning one, bro. Every day's a learning one. Seriously.
Every day.
Every day.
The minute you think you know everything, that's when you stop learning. That's just the reality. So I appreciate you all, family. Until next time, y'all know what to do. Always bet on black. Peace.
Peace.
Before you go, make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. Thank you for supporting the channel. And remember, here at Lumumba Speaks, we always bet on black. Peace.